Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. My name is Terry McVenes, President and CEO of RTCA. Welcome to all of you to what is now our 20th in a series of webinars that we call Aviation Technology Connect. 2 years ago, we created this series of webinars to serve as a catalyst to bring forth some timely visibility of significant issues impacting aviation stakeholders. And during this time, we've heard from a variety of aviation industry leaders, including the FAA Administrator, Chairman of the NTSB, and other technical leaders. We've discussed government aviation policy, infrastructure, and some of the technical challenges we are facing today and in the future. Our goal was and continues to be to educate you, the audience, further inspire you in your profession, and perhaps even evolve your thinking as to where the industry is today and where it's going in the future. All of our previous webinars were recorded, as is this one. So if you want to go back and listen to any of our previous webinars, you can find those recordings on the RTCA YouTube channel. I know many of you watching are familiar with RTCA, but with the large audience that we have today, we undoubtedly have some first-time visitors with us. So I want to just take a moment to familiarize you with who we are. RTCA is an aviation-centered safety standards development organization whose mission is to inspire the creation and the implementation of integrated performance standards that meet the changing global aviation environment and further ensure the safety, security, sustainability, and the overall health of the aviation ecosystem. Now, in addition to developing standards, we also provide training to government and industry personnel on the application of those standards and developing the basis for certification and testing. And on the screen, you can see a few of our upcoming training events that we have coming in September. Our Safety Management Systems course is becoming extremely popular, especially for some of the new entrants coming into the aviation industry. We also have our Airworthiness Security Certification course and our courses on DO-178C and DO-160G coming up in September. And then in October, we'll again be offering our newest course, The Role of Human Factors in Flight Deck Design and Certification. Now, after 2 years of development in collaboration with government and industry recognized human factors experts and teaming up with Georgia Tech University, we're excited about this latest addition to the RTCA catalog of training classes. We first offered this course last month and was very well received by those that participated in the class. And you can sign up for any of our courses via our website at www.rtca.org. If you are interested or have any questions about our training, our standards development work, or are interested in becoming a part of the RTCA family of members so that you too can have a voice in developing the performance standards that are so critical to the safety of our industry, you can contact us directly through our website or via telephone. Now, our ability to bring you these webinars would not be possible without the generous sponsorships from our industry partners. And today, I'm especially thankful to the Airline Pilots Association, Collins Aerospace, and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, which are gold corporate sponsors for our series this year. And also sponsoring today's webinar is Garmin International. On this platform, you're going to be able to submit questions to our panelists today. And so to do so, just click on the Q&A tab and we'll do our best to get all of your questions answered. So let's get started. I mentioned human factors in my introductory comments. And of course, that's the topic of today's webinar. In aviation, safety is the cornerstone, really our North Star, if you will, of everything that we do. And as safety professionals, we demand that of ourselves, and it's the expectation of the traveling public. Now I've been in this industry a long time and I've seen, been at the scene of accidents and incidents where things went terribly wrong. And afterwards, I've heard way too many times, well, the airplane performed as it was designed, or the equipment operating the way it was supposed to. The crew performed their duties as recommended by the manufacturer and trained by the airline. The airline and the crew operated in compliance with the regulations, and so on and so on. Yet an accident occurred, and in some cases, people lost their lives, with everyone pointing the finger and trying to shift the blame away to some other organization or some other person. Again, as safety professionals, it's important that we do not get caught up in this blame game. We need to look at safety as the means to ensure that the total system works together to avoid any adverse outcomes in the real world. And human factors is a very key component, the glue, if you will, that will make that happen. Now, when we talk about human factors, that can be an overly broad topic. So what we're going to do today is focus on how the certification of aircraft interfaces with airline operations, air traffic control, and others in the contribution to this total system approach to safety. And with our panelists, we're going to look at those aspects of the system that can really make a difference in how well people do their jobs. And again, that total systems approach, the combination of human, equipment, procedures, training, and the environment, all of those components, how well they add up to a consistent and repeatable safe operation and performance every day. Now, I'm excited to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Three of my favorite people I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. First, Dr. Kathy Abbott, the Chief Scientific and Technical Advisor on Human Factors for the Federal Aviation Administration. Next, Ms. Gretchen Haskins, who is the board member and former CEO of HeliOffshore based in London, also a member of the Board of Governors for the Flight Safety Foundation. And Dr. Ratan Khatwa, lead strategist and designer for Boeing, who has a wealth of experience in human factors at Honeywell, Collins, and other places, and now, of course, at Boeing. Kathy, Gretchen, Ratan, welcome back to RTCA, and thank you for being here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read everyone's biography, but for the audience, you can find their bios. You can access them on the RTCA website. And we've got a lot to cover in the next 50 minutes or so. So to keep things organized for our discussion today, I've divided things up into three primary focus areas. And then at the end, we're going to do a wind-up session on what the future should look like. And for our audience, our goal today is to provide you some clear takeaways from the discussion that you can take back to your workplace in your quest of continued enhancements in your role as an industry safety professional. So for the first section, I'd like to start with defining the role of human factors in the safety of the aviation system. We now have had several decades of experience with what have become traditional roles and tools to assure system safety, such as safety risk management, safety management systems, FOCO and ASAP programs, the work of CAST and ASIAS. But the role of human factors in those programs, at least in my experience, has probably been minimal. So first, let's start off with that definition of human factors. Kathy, you want to start? How would you define human factors?
Sure. Thank you, Terry, and I'm very happy to be here. There's a lot of different definitions of human factors out there, and some of them are very detailed, but my favorite one is that human factors is anything that affects human performance. It's concise, but it expresses the depth and the breadth of what human factors covers. It's not just about the individual or even a team of individuals, but the environment, the design of equipment, all the things that you talked about as being part of the total system. And human factors addresses that and includes consideration of that.
Gretchen, I've been using the phrase total system safety, and I think that's something I probably borrowed from you and some of our discussions over the years. So what does total system safety mean to you?
Well, it comes down to safety happens in the operational front line. So having this focus during the design and certification process is really helpful. So the main question you're asking yourself is, does it all add up? You know, does the combination of human, equipment, procedures, training, environment, culture, everything, you know, help people to consistently perform well and make sure that we're going to be safe and nobody dies, you know? And so asking the question, how do we make sure we support human performance by all of the factors in the system? And it includes looking at interfaces. So it includes, you know, I always think of runway excursions. That includes the airport, the airline, ATC, you know, the aircraft is landing in a total system and you want to make sure it can land safely.
Great. Back to you, Kathy. You know, certainly from a regulatory perspective, you probably see different tools or processes that are out there that can aid in that design of a safe system. What do you see as some of those tools that are applicable from a human factors perspective, at least from a design standpoint?
From a design standpoint, I would say a non-traditional answer might be a lot of the data that's out there about how operations actually happen. Those data need to be used, but they also need to be used in the context of, if you think from aircraft certification, the testing, the analysis, the simulations that get done as part of showing compliance to the regulations and establishing that that compliance is there. So there's a lot of pieces to that picture, and tools can be a very general term, but I mentioned a few of them that are some of the very common ones that people are using.
And Ratan, you've been in the OEM part of the business for a long time. Are there certain tools or processes that you see that are very helpful in designing that safe system?
I'd like to just echo Kathy's message. And so really, you know, as a typical design team would really start off with trying to understand the operational context. So we're looking at incident data, we're looking at line observation data, you know, we're performing focus groups with the pilots to understand, of course, their needs in that operational context. So there's a huge body of work that's done at the beginning, as Kathy has said, which really I would sort of paraphrase as analysis. And then as we go through the design, you know, we go through the ideation, the design, and a body of work from Jacob Nielsen would apply there. And at the end of the day, we're going through the iterative refinement of the user interface, and we're starting off with very, very primitive prototypes. Could be on paper. At some point, we'll end up, you know, in a lab. We'll end up on a bench. We'll end up finally in an engineering simulator and in flight testing. And that's already been said. I think the critical thing here is it's that entire journey that helps us identify a lot of the blind spots in the design. So it isn't just a single place where we do that. And I think the other thing that's really important in this entire journey is the incorporation of a multidisciplinary team. So it isn't obviously just human factors people. We've got pilots, we've got certification specialists, we've got displays and graphics specialists. So I think it's just that entire journey that is basically supported by a multidisciplinary team that really makes it happen.
I really support Ratan's point about a multidisciplinary team. And I also think sometimes it's helpful to get in people from outside the organization, end users. It could be ground handlers, air traffic control, pilots, maintenance personnel, depending on what aspect you're looking at. And you're kind of looking at three things. What could go wrong and how do we prevent it? How do we recognize it when it does happen and resolve it safely? So how do we fail safe, you know? And then, and that includes, you know, human error, and that includes system failures, and that includes anything that could go wrong. And then the second thing is what needs to go consistently right. And, you know, can that happen with a range of users? And then finally, can people do their job in realistic scenarios, planned and unplanned events, using the combination of the equipment, the procedures, the training, and everything that they have, the tools that are available to them to do their job.
And to build on top of that, if I may, Terry,
yeah.
One of the characteristics of aviation that we all have to deal with is change. There's evolving technology, there's evolving operations, there's evolving knowledge and skills of the people in the system, evolving culture of the organizations. And that needs to be accounted for as well. So helping people not only deal with the existing operational variability, but designing the systems to enable them to be flexible enough to deal with change, I think is going to be very important as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we're in a very rapidly advanced, a lot of advancements in innovative technologies are coming forth probably faster than they ever have. And, you know, how are the things that we need to be doing to embrace that new technology successfully, but at the same time support the end user's needs to ensure safety is maintained? I mean, how do we deal with that? Whoever would like to answer. Ratan, why don't you start?
I'll start, Terry, thank you. So if we look at the body of data that we have available to us, which really means line observation data, it means things such as incident data, accident data. what the data typically tells us is there are areas or patterns of vulnerability. Now, there'll be multiple areas, and I'll just give a few examples here. The first one of these is, vulnerabilities in perception, in other words, situation awareness. Vulnerabilities in information processing, for example, decision making. So it could be a no-go decision on when you're approaching V1, or whether to go around on approach or land. We see the peaks and the troughs in workload. We look at resource management. So I've just sort of pointed out a number of things where we're seeing sort of vulnerabilities in the data that we look at. Now, if we come back to the question, how can technology help? So what I've been seeing, over the last couple of decades is that the systems that we're designing are really trying to address these vulnerabilities, and they fall in a couple of areas. One is information management. The second area is the information automation. The other area is decision aids. So these are the sorts of at a high level, these are the sorts of functions that are trying to address those vulnerabilities. And I'll give you some very, very clear examples just to sort of illustrate this point. So if we just start with a head-up display, right? If we start with next to go to an electronic checklist, an airport moving map, or actually an electronic chart with own ship symbol on there. So if we start thinking about, what do these things do in terms of enhancing perception, in terms of enhancing decision making? And then, of course, some of my favorites, as you very well know, Terry, if we talk about decision making aids, the enhanced ground proximity warning system in terms of awareness and alerting function. And of course, more recently, the runway overrun awareness and alerting system, which essentially does the same thing, but for overruns. So I think the role of technology here really is, when it's used appropriately, it has a very, very powerful role in terms of addressing the crew, supporting the crew.
Kind of related to the new technology piece, also applies perhaps in all the different types of users that we have in the airspace. We have a lot of different types of users, both current ones and some future ones coming our way. Are there significant differences that have to be considered in both the design and regulation, say between large transporter category aircraft, business jets, general aviation? What are some of the differences that have to be thought about? Kathy, you want to take that to start?
Sure, I'll take that to start. The FAA has what we call a safety continuum, and that is that recognizing that different segments of aviation have different acceptable levels of risk. And the highest safety is applied to the commercial passenger carrying aircraft, transport aircraft in particular. And so therefore the standards of safety are the highest for them. There's some differences with some of the other categories to allow for the differences in risk. If you tie that back with technologies, one of the points about technology, it can be a real benefit. And one question we need to ask ourselves with it is, what is the purpose of it? Because technology is a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself. So one of the considerations that we have to look at very closely is, how do these technologies affect or potentially affect safety? How do you leverage the technologies to get the safety benefits without adding additional risks? Because the bottom line is that from a regulatory point of view, the humans in the system are responsible for the safety of the operation. Pilot in command is responsible for the safety of flight. So we have to consider all these factors, technology or otherwise, in the context of how does it enable the responsible human in maintaining the safety of the system.
I can't help but think of Sully, landing on the Hudson without a human in the loop. I hate to think how that would have ended. And so it's getting the best out of the partnership between human and technology. The other thing I thought that Ratan mentioned about the importance of technology, I think the training area is a really big area where technology can help, and it can help people adapt to change. Because one of the things we know about human factors is, people need to get it into their long-term memory and their motor skills so that they can not overload their short-term memory during a time of change. So technology could help with practice to help people learn new skills.
One question just came in from the audience, as long as we're talking about kind of definitions of human factors. It can be a very objective one, I think, Kathy, as you pointed out, but sometimes there's a lot of subjectivity in human factors analysis. Do you care to kind of either of you want to comment on that? How you take something that can be very rigid, perhaps, or well defined, but there's still some analysis and there's some subjectivity behind it.
Well, I think it's kind of ironic that people talk about human factors being so subjective when in fact there's actually quite a bit of objectivity and quantitative analysis that has to be done, statistical analysis and so on. And we also have subjectivity in other areas. I mean, engineering judgment is a perfect example of that. So I think that it's a misunderstanding of human factors to think that it is purely or even mostly subjective. There's a lot of science and engineering behind it. And I think that's important to understand. People who don't understand the field may not realize the full depth and the extent of the information that's out there.
Yes, I do agree with you, Kathy, 100%. So I think part of the challenge that we all have, you know, is really conveying the role of human factors in design and certification. And as Kathy has rightly pointed out, it is just a lot more than a subjective assessment. In fact, it's a very important part of the equation. But a lot of what we do is apply the scientific principles in trying to understand the limitations and the strengths of the end user, and how do we embrace that in developing a system and actually analyzing it and designing the system. So I think, you know, in terms of, you know, what do we measure when we are developing and assessing these systems? I mean, it all comes down to looking at human performance. I mean, the very nature of human performance means that there are actually tangible metrics. It could be time on task. It could be certainly a subjective workload assessment. But I think it all comes down to, for a particular intended function or use, you know, for that particular application, you know, it's important to define those metrics, and they certainly are both objective and subjective. And so from my point of view, you know, for the panel, really, it's the combination of those two measures that actually can be very powerful in terms of, you know, a system design. I mean, at the end of the day, what we want is high pilot acceptance or user acceptance, and you want obviously superior user experience. So it's the combination of those two things, and that's what human factors allows us really to do. So again, Terry, I feel that, you know, there are probably many people out there that still have this misperception of human factors, and there's a role here for us to play in terms of conveying, you know, what is the value proposition of human factors and what's its real role in system design and certification. And
there's a fairly clear thing that you can do. You can look at what are critical tasks. You know, the critical functions that the human-machine combination have to perform in takeoff, landing, cruise, fault diagnosis, you know, you can navigation, whatever. You can look at task performance in terms of time, accuracy, completeness. You know, there's a number of measurable things. And the data we have today can help us look at what level of performance can be achieved on a typical day. And is it consistent? Is it repeatable? What goes wrong? And, you know, is that able to fail safe? And so it's easier than ever with the data systems we have to look at, will this system really work in real life? And that's really what human factors is trying to do.
Okay. I'd like to now shift from that part of the discussion over to kind of the next key area I want to talk about, and that's the regulatory side of the topic. I believe it was about 10 years ago, my memory serves me correctly, that Section 25.1302 was inserted into the Code of Federal Regulations that And this applied to installed systems and equipment for flight crew members. But it covered not only the installation, but also how information about those systems need to be provided to the crews. So Kathy, can you give us a little bit of history on 1302 and describe in a little bit more detail than I did what some of the key aspects to that regulation were?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to do that. And to do that, I'm going to have to go back a little bit further than 10 years.
Yeah.
More like 25 or more.
Yeah.
So back in the mid-90s, the FAA recognized that there were a series of accidents occurring that we didn't fully understand because they didn't involve technical failures or failures of equipment on the airplane. The airplanes were functioning as, I think, Ratan, you said earlier, they're functioning as designed. Terry mentioned this too. But we were seeing these accidents and the FAA wanted to understand what was going on with that. So the traditional view of system safety was looking at technical failures. And the idea here was to look beyond that, to look at the broader picture. So they formed a human factors team to look at the accident cases, evaluate them, look at the design processes, and get a sense of what needed to be done to address some of these safety concerns. One of the recommendations that came out of that was a recommendation to develop a means by which design-related pilot error could be evaluated as part of the aircraft certification process. Now, one thing to be clear about is there are a lot of human factors aspects in a number of the aircraft certification regulations. So it's not that this was the first time human factors would be considered, but it was a brand new regulation that was general applicability. And the regulation itself has basically two conceptual parts. One is, what are the design characteristics that we know help pilots avoid error through the design? Because remember, we're regulating the design. So what design characteristics should be looked for in aircraft certification to help avoid error through good design that enables the pilot to do the job, the tasks that are intended, the functions that are intended by the equipment? A second aspect of it, though, was recognizing that errors will occur even with well-designed systems, well-qualified crews, well-trained. So the system design needed to enable the pilots to manage the errors and to deal with those. So those are the two pieces of 25-1302, is looking at the general design characteristics of how to avoid error and then how to mitigate the ones that are going to happen anyway. So that's a start on a bit of the history, and it complements the rest of the human factors related aspects of the aircraft certification regulations.
So Ratan, from a designer's aspect, what role did 1302 play in human error considerations, for example?
Yes, I think it all comes back to the purpose of 1302, and as Kathy has outlined very eloquently, there's two elements, right? There's the design-induced error, or trying to avoid the design-induced errors, and then secondly, the management of errors on the flight deck. So I think the impact that 1302 has really had to the industry is sort of is multifold, actually. The first part of what we've really been doing is, I think it's helped refine the way that we've actually been doing our designs. So in other words, it's not that human factors wasn't considered before, but I just think we've got a lot more disciplined in the way that we've produced the data to actually justify the design. And of course, that's a natural refinement of the design through the program lifecycle. So I think that is a key, and we talked about this already, that human factors isn't just a subjective discipline, there's a lot of data. So I think the first impact that it's had on the industry is that it's allowed us to be a lot more robust. It's not that we weren't doing those things before, but it all comes down to not just, here's the user interface, and this is what it does. A key piece of it, if we go back in the journey of how the design evolved, is to produce the justification and the rationale. That, I think, is a key piece for the industry. And you hear me probably say this over and over again. In my opinion, data is key here, right? So I think that is a major piece of what we've had to do to evolve. We've just had to be a lot more better and disciplined at producing the data and the justification to show why the design is the way it is.
And Gretchen, you've kind of been on many different parts of our industry, but from an operator side, what have you kind of seen as the impact of 1302 in the work that you've been doing?
I really genuinely do think it's a game changer. I mean, people were doing similar things before, but 1302 really set it all out in one place. It was clear about the objectives, and it was clear about some of the outcomes that you need to produce. And I do think that, if you look at what makes 1302 work, I think there's a few things. One is you need the design, training, and procedures developed together earlier than traditionally. You don't design and then figure out what the procedures and training are, because it's too late to influence the design. Human factors and a total systems approach means you do all of that together, and then you can test to see if it works and do your analysis to see if you need to make changes to easy for me to say, changes to the design to better support human performance. The other thing, or the training or procedures, by the way, the other thing I'd say is linking it to SMS. And, SMS is only coming in for manufacturers, but it's critical because you're looking at, what are the things that could go wrong and that could kill people, right? And what do we have to be good at on a typical day to prevent that outcome? And so you're looking at the scenarios you pick and the documents you produce, showing the set of things that are in place to support consistently effective performance and avoid those adverse outcomes from the SMS. And you collect data to check that the arguments you're making really can be supported by evidence. And this is the kind of thing that should be governed within a business, an organization, and within across organizations with the regulator. I'm pleased that that the performance-based regulation approach has come online, because it helps people say, what are the top risks? What are the actions in the design process that support those risks? And how do we measure or judge? And what's the evidence that shows it works? And that's a more operational focus. So it's easier for the certification process to match the SMS process that's going on within the operators. It's easier to have sharing of data. We're talking about the same adverse effects, and we can have end users, from the operational units come in and support this design and certification process and, help check, does it all add up from the beginning of the design process? So it's a long answer, but
Yeah.
I think 1302's done a lot.
I think, Jerry, just to add to Gretchen, because she used the word process several times in what she said, and I think it's really, really key here. Again, my experience has been that if 1302 is not a part of the organizational DNA, in other words, if it's not part of the systems engineering process, which ultimately produces the specification. Now remember, human factors is one cog in this big machinery that produces a flight deck or an entire aircraft. And so key here, for 1302 to be successful is the formalization of that discipline within the systems engineering process, because if it's not, I don't think it's going to achieve certainly my experience has been, it won't achieve the effectiveness of what we all collectively are trying to achieve. So it's really, really key that it is formalized within that whole process.
So I have a question from the audience. 1302 obviously was looking at human factors considerations on the flight deck. Is there any applications that can be utilized as we start thinking about human factors in autonomous operations? Is 1302 going to apply there, or is it going to take a whole new regulation? Conjecture on your part, Kathy. Let's start there.
Well, one of the first things you would have to do is define autonomous. And many people define it in different ways. I think that the new entrants that are talking about terms like increased automation, autonomy, and different ways of implementing it are looking at a lot of different ways of accomplishing that. There's talk about the vehicles that would be completely independent from the ground. There's things that would be operated from the ground. There would be a lot of different configurations. And so to say that there's one general regulation to cover that, we're going to have to look at that real carefully, see what we need to do. But one thing I can guarantee you is there will be humans in the system.
Yeah.
And humans somewhere in the system will be responsible. And the question you have to ask, and let's face it, regulations are a form of risk management. And you're moving risk around the system. You talk about human error, we talk about pilot error. But if you don't have a pilot, are you then concerned about designer error? And what about maintainer error? So in the spirit of what Gretchen had talked about a total systems approach, we need to look at that whole picture and see what needs to be certified, if you will, the different people in the system, the equipment in the system, the operation itself. So we're going to have to look at the big picture. We're going to have to keep an open mind. And the ways that we have done things, some will work, some will have to be adjusted. We haven't tried yet to apply 1302 to that.
So Ratan, since 1302 was implemented, what have we learned from it? Any particular things we've learned?
Yes, I think so. We've been talking a lot about people actually in this whole discussion. And so one thing that we've learned is that having a background in human factors doesn't automatically mean that you have the skill set to be engaged automatically in the design and certification of commercial aircraft. Now, that is not meant to be a negative remark in any sense at all. But what I'm really trying to say here is that there is a skill, that there is training that is required to engage in all of 1302. So that is one thing that we have definitely learned, right, is that the people that are engaged in this process must have, you know, the skills to perform this. So that's sort of the first thing. The second thing, and this is a personal learning in applying 1302, and I talked a little about earlier, is that, you know, in any program, you've sort of got the design element, in essentially defining the user interface, whether it's entire flight deck or pieces of it, such as the nav display or an FMS function. Then you've got design, so it's design, and then you've got certifications. You've got two key elements. Now, it doesn't mean that they're separate, of course. There isn't a natural overlap if we drew a Venn diagram here. So one of the key learnings is that as we go through that whole process of the human factors analysis, the iterative prototypes that are developed to define the user interface and the requirements that eventually goes in the spec, the point is that data has been collected. You know, we've done, you know, design reviews, we've done human factors evaluations in simulators, in engineering simulators, and in-flight evaluations. Again, all for part of the development phase, not showing compliance. So I think one of the key things for me is that if done correctly, and if actually negotiated with the regulatory authority, the certification agency, all of the work that is done in the design, right, the definition of the UI and the data and the design history can actually play a very, very powerful role during certification. And I've said this before, you know, human factor certification is not a test at the end, right, of the program, right? It is a, and I'll you know, you've heard me saying this before, it's a journey, right? So all of what we do in the design, actually, if done properly and if discussed and negotiated with the regulatory agency, has a very, very powerful role, or can have a very powerful role at time of certification. Again, it's all a question of trying to justify the design and the design rationale. And that's what we're trying to do, obviously, in terms of when we're showing compliance. So that to me is key. And I'll open up to Kathy or to Gretchen if they have any further comments on that.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, Ratan. I'd like to build on what you said. I completely agree with your points. I think we might want to think about two categories. One is we need human factor specialists. And by the way, the specialties that they need for design and certification are somewhat different than the specialties that are needed for some of the operational domains and so on. So we need the specialists that can meet the need for the specific tasks in design and certification. But we also need, I think, for the general engineering population to have a better understanding of human factors. They don't have to become specialists, but it would be incredibly helpful for them to have a better understanding of what is involved and why it's important to consider the human and the effect on the human of the design decisions that they make from an engineering perspective. So that's a point that I think is really critical, that you need both.
And I think that's a really, oh, go ahead, Gretchen.
Oh, no, it's just one thing I would add to it, because I agree with all the points that have been made, is, and I think we need to teach human factors engineers about how to make the business case and the safety case for changes to the design process. So link human performance with safe performance, efficiencies, productivity, effectiveness, and value. And we also need to really communicate, because I am the person that has read 1,000-page safety cases. And if you're going to get the CEO of an organization to decide, you know, to spend a lot of money to manage a risk, I think we have to find ways to do the rigorous analysis, but communicate the stories and the data in a really clear, simple way, so that we get change to happen and we get the right decisions to happen. So we could do some human factors on our own products to help make them easy to use.
And that's a great segue into our third section, and that's culture, safety culture. You know, this has been a huge deal for our industry as well, for other industries as well. And at least in my time in the industry, we've seen a really big transformation from what in the old days, you know, safety culture is just kind of implied, but it wasn't always, I would say, followed through on, to where we are today, where it's much more deliberate. And it starts with a lot of the CEOs and board of directors, and it permeates down through the organization to the frontline personnel. So kind of an open discussion for all three of you. What needs to be done to support that mindset, to include human factors as part of the culture in design and certification at that corporate management level, to ensure it permeates down through the organization?
I might be able to start on that one, because I had this boss when I worked in air traffic control. And the first thing he said, we used to have this very analytical way of partitioning risk. There was stuff that was our fault and stuff that was somebody else's fault. And he said, yeah, but either way, there'll be an accident in our airspace, and that's not going to be okay. And so he said, I want you to start looking at the stuff that really matters, that could kill people, and look at it now at what do we need to do differently to ensure nobody dies, right? And so we started working differently with the GA community, the airlines, you know, the ground handling crews at the airport and the airports. And we started looking at what were the fundamental tasks that people had to do and who could do what to make it a better system and better support human performance. And that collaboration and that senior level mindset, we're going to make sure nobody dies on our watch, changed everything. And I can tell you, our safety performance used to improve about 7% a year. We had a lot of data. We improved our performance by 70% in 3 years using that change of approach. And so a very proactive design in safer operations in a collaborative way really makes a difference.
I think I'd just like to add to that, Terry. From my perspective, any element of safety and human factors, of course, needs support from the top. I don't need to recite that to anybody, and it really means that it needs to be part of the organizational DNA. So what I've seen, certainly in my current organization and when I was at Honeywell, is really the sort of the P's, if you will. The first you have the people, and we talked about that, right? Then you have the practice, right? The process, excuse me. And I've talked about that already in terms of ensuring that it's part of the organization, the systems engineering process, and there's command meetings support it, right? Then you've got the practice, and that really means the best practices to support, each of the elements of the human factors processes embedded inside the organization. I think so. There's sort of all those usual P's, right? And of course the programs. I think the other thing, and Gretchen, you sort of skirted on it, that's really important, is you talked about, convincing leadership that this is not, you didn't use these words, but human factors is not a tax on the programs, right? And it isn't. And I think one of the key things that we've all learned is that, in fact, it's the exact opposite, because what it's allowing us to do is, as I've talked about this journey from the beginning to the end, that journey, certainly at the beginning, is allowing us to uncover a lot of the blind spots, a lot of the areas of risk that may actually permeate downstream. And I think all of us can, been there, last minute changes, last minute discoveries are not usually welcome on any program. We know that, right? That's just the way it works. But I think one of the keys here is to understand that, right? It's part of what we're doing here is to uncover the difficult areas, uncover the risk areas, and we can address those at a very, very early part of the program. So I think that's part of the story as far as I see it. It's got to come from the top. We need the people, we need the process, we need the practice, and we need to understand that, as you've said, the business case, it isn't necessarily just about that, but that's obviously a key element of it. And I think, my experience has been, we can have, in terms of cycle time, if we want to talk about that, there's opportunity there as well to make this whole thing a lot more efficient.
And
So,
just
so
to add,
Kath, I was going to say, Kathy, a lot of organizations have an SMS in place now, safety management systems. Does that mean human factors is part of it?
I would have to say no, not necessarily. It seems like it would make sense to do that, but just because you have an SMS doesn't mean that all these things are in place. There's still a lot of lessons to be learned in how to implement those. And if I could go back to the discussion of safety culture for just a minute, because part of what SMS is intended to do is to help advocate and enable a safety culture. But about 15 years ago, I was asked to help work on a project internal to the FAA after an airplane accident happened. And the question we were asked to look at was, how is pilot decision making affected by the organizational culture? First of all, is it affected? And the answer is obviously yes, but the question is, how was it affected? And in looking at that, some clear points came out. And one is that you can't look at safety culture within an organization outside of the context of the other aspects of the organizational culture. There's a lot of different risks that an organization deals with, not just safety risk. There's financial risk, there's reputation, there's schedule risk, there's all kinds of different aspects. And if you want to improve the safety piece of it and integrate human factors into it, and those are not exactly the same thing, but they're obviously very related. But if you really want to integrate it in there, you need to understand the overall culture in which it's getting integrated. And I also want to emphasize human factors is more than safety. That's the primary point from a regulatory aspect, but it's also about effectiveness and making sure that things are operationally effective. And that's related to safety as well.
And I think it was Ratan, you mentioned, that you don't do a human factors evaluation at the end of the project. It's integrated from the very beginning, you know, and it's first thought about all the way through the design, certification, and even the operational approvals. But part of that then means you can't just have one person off on the side being your HF person. It's part of having a team of people that are engaged all the time. But so part of that whole culture, if you're going to do that, is you got to have the right trained workforce to do it. So where are the engineers getting the learning on human factors, or where should they be getting the learning?
So I think the academic institutions have done, to be frank, a fantastic job in helping develop human factor specialists. And as I've already said before, and Kathy has mentioned, you know, there is, you know, going from that to applying that to commercial flight tech design and certification, there are other skill sets that come into play. So I think that's a key piece of it, and trying to understand what those things are. Now, I know years ago in the UK, you know, Cranfield University used to do a course on human factors for flight deck certification. Don Harris, most of us know Don. And today, I know that there is a module that University of Stuttgart in Germany has in their aero engineering course that's very powerful. It's very in-depth, and it's on design and certification. But this is not standard curricula in certainly in academia today. So I think industry, and I think the regulators would be certainly open to this. I think we need to open up a dialogue with the academic institutions to help sort of bridge that skill gap. Again, we're having amazing people that are coming through, but there are additional skills needed. And I just don't know if the academic institutions are really aware what industry or regulator needs are. So that's a dialogue I think that's worth having. There are other avenues for obviously enhancing the knowledge and skills of our people. I'll let Kathy and Gretchen comment on that, and we can come back to it if there's more time.
Yeah, I think what you're really talking about too is what I'd like to kind of wind up our discussion on, and that's, you know, what does that future really look like? And we talked about changes in technology, but there also needs to be changes in the workforce. You know, how are the changes we're going to see in users' technology, concepts of use for aviation? How is that going to affect human factors and certification for the future? Gretchen, you start.
Okay, I'll go for it. Well, I mean, I think we've got more computer savvy people coming our way. We've got people that are used to getting high quality information in more sound bites, and we are learning more about how people learn, so that we're smarter about, you know, not giving someone a long, boring PowerPoint presentation and expecting them to remember it all, you know, or a -1 for a flight crew manual that's just, you know, hundreds of pages, you know. So I think we're going to have to adapt to meet the new users we're going to see. We're going to have different modes of operation. You know, if you put autonomous aircraft into the mix, you know, there's more and newer organizations coming into the aviation space that may not have the same traditions. So we're going to need to share, you know, the SMS approach. We're going to need to collaborate, and we're going to see if it still adds up to support effective and safe performance with a different set of people, organizations, and jobs. But the fundamental questions remain the same. You need to keep asking the question, you know, who are the users? What do they need to do to perform their job safely? And, you know, what capabilities do they have? What vulnerabilities do they have? And design for that. You know, we need to keep looking at what are the most important adverse conditions? What are the events that can cause fatalities? And how do we ensure that we're going to fail, that we don't have the error, we design it out if we can, we fail safe, and we consistently perform the tasks that are critical consistently well. We need to collaborate more than ever. And I think, you know, we need to be able to do the simple things, like just write a document that says, you know, what are my top risks? What are the things that counter that risk? And where's my evidence that it's all going to be okay? And we should be having that conversation. You know, I would call that an SMS conversation, but if it's living and breathing, we're having that conversation between organizations and across one organization, but most importantly with our end users, because they're the ones who are going to have to deliver safety every day. So, you know, the changes in them should be apparent if we're writing down a little document. They used to call it a target audience description in the military. You know, who are these people? What are their capabilities? And we're discussing how they're changing over time. You know, what are the tasks they have to do as that changes and evolves? And can they do it? You know, it's pretty straightforward stuff, but it does require a mindset that's saying, you know, will this all add up in real life? And what more can we do to support people so that it does?
Really trying to understand who we're designing for,
Right.
what we need to be doing to adapt to those changes.
Right.
Yeah, Kathy, with some of the changes in technology, any thoughts in terms of how human factors considerations need to be deployed to address new technologies in the future?
Well, and it's not just new technologies. I wanted to build on something that both Gretchen and Ratan has said. Gretchen talked extensively about the end user. So has Ratan, also has talked about the design engineers and the design community. But I also want to mention that we need to make sure that this knowledge and expertise is broad-based, and it's not just for the end user, and it's not just for the design engineers. You have to consider the other people in the system, the maintainers, the regulators.
Yeah.
We have been doing extensive work on expanding our human factors workforce within both aircraft certification and the operations side, because we recognize the need for it. We're also working extensively on education for the broader workforce. As I mentioned earlier, we need that breadth. And I think that is going to help us deal with the changes that we're seeing, the changes in technology, the expansion of new entrants. One of the things that people don't always think about from the regulator's perspective, we have to consider the full range of airspace users, all the different kinds of vehicles, all the different kinds of operators. So everything from experimental, general aviation, all the way to commercial space, to the full range. It would take a long time to provide that list because that list is growing pretty quickly. But I think we need to consider all the people in the system that are going to be influential in having to apply human factors.
Yeah. And Ratan, just one last question in this area. Who's going to define that future? And how is industry going to solve some of those future challenges that we have?
I think I have to have a bit of a historical review here, Terry, in terms of who's going to define the future. Because if I look back, you know, the 31 years that I've been in this industry and look and see where I started and where we are today, there's sort of a platform for me to sort of think through. I think when I look at where we are today, I look at the end user, and I look at the changes that are taking place. I mean, my kids are now old enough to start flying. So when I look, they're digital natives, right? So when we talk about who's going to define the future, so I think there has to be a very, very careful consideration, and both Gretchen and Kathy have obviously already touched on it, but it would be, you know, I guess it's important to point that out again. I think part of what I've seen in terms of the technology evolutions is the impact, and this might sound sort of fairly trivial, but it is important, the impact of consumer electronics in the flight deck. In other words, the design language that we use today, certainly within business aviation, and the expectations of the end user. There's no question that has had an influence. Not everything looks like, of course, an iPhone or a Samsung device, if you will, whatever your flavor is, but there's no question, right? So there's the demographics of the end user, the influence from the adjacent industries such as consumer electronics. Then when I look at, I mean, I sort of see this as a sort of 4x4 matrix. So there's the end user, there is basically the technology that's coming in, right? Then there is a certification basis, and Kathy's already touched on that. You know, is it part 23? Is it 25? Is it 27? And is it 29? And then you've got the operational environment. So, for example, you may have a helicopter that will never cruise above 10,000 feet, whereas a high-end business jet might be up in the high 40s, right? So when I look at the intersection of the end user, right, with the technology environment that we've got, with the certification environment, when I sort of look at that sort of, and of course, we've talked about the mission. So I think those are all considerations in terms of where the future of our industry is going, but I still feel that a lot of it will be pushed by, you know, adjacent industries and our understanding of how the end users are changing and their expectations and their needs.
And I would submit organizations like RTCA as standards organizations have a role in helping bring the industry and the regulators together to help, you know, collaborate on some of these future challenges that we have too. So want to close out. We're at the top of the hour, a little bit of a lightning round. As we close out, I think you remember I told our audience you're going to get some clear takeaways from our discussion today. So for each of you, I'd like you to give me and the audience 2 to 3 key points you'd like to leave us with. 60 seconds or less. This is your elevator speech. Kathy, you go first.
Okay, first item I would say is what I said at the beginning about system safety needs to go beyond what we have historically thought of it as being. It needs to be broader, bigger picture, not just equipment failures, but including the entire system. That's point number 1. Point number 2, we need to design systems to enable people to deal with changing operational environments, changing technology, and changing overall systems. And actually that's for all the people in the system. And last but not least, data sharing is critical. So the more that can be shared, that's a better thing, although there's certainly challenges with that, with the overwhelming amount of data that we have. However, if you don't have the data, then you can't deal with it. So that's an important piece. And human factors is contingent, successful application of human factors is contingent on applying that data and understanding the scientific and engineering basis behind human factors.
Great. Gretchen,
So my
your
3
60
things,
seconds.
I'll do it as quick as possible. My 3 things are frontline focus, communicating value, and collaborating. And just to say what I mean by that, so safety happens in the front line. The more you consider this during the design process, the better. Communicating a clear and compelling case, a business case, for enhancing the system. And you can do that to say how they're going to better support people in terms of their safety performance, their productivity, and their business resilience. And you can make a very strong case for this if you look at their task performance. And then thirdly, collaborate. And a good place to start is if everybody has an SMS and they write down, these are our top risks, the top things that we're worried about. These are the actions we put in place. And here's how we know whether it's worked. And you're constantly asking, have we got the right risks, the right actions, the right outcomes, and what have we missed? And that's a good way to collaborate.
Great. Thank you. Ratan?
Yeah, so my top 3 really are understand the end user and their needs. And we've talked about, obviously, the evolution of the needs for the end user in the operational environment that's involved. And so again, the end user, and understand their needs. Number 2, embrace pilots as partners in design. Embrace pilots as partners in design. They're not doing drive-bys at design reviews and during evaluations. It's a very, very key point for me. Embrace pilots as partners in design. Number 3, and I've got 3.5, Terry. Number 3, naturally, I'm an engineer. Number 3, data is king, right? And Kathy's already talked about this, right? I mean, in terms of what we do, in terms of how we define the flight deck or an individual system, data has got to absolutely drive that. And my point 5 is about certification again. I've talked a lot about design, but certification is embedded from day one of the program. It is baked into the analysis. It is baked into the design. It is baked into the evaluation and certificate, and obviously the compliance work. It isn't something that's done right at the end. So those are my sort of 3.5 points, Terry. I think it's just, hopefully there's some food for thought for everybody there. Thank you.
Great. Hey, fabulous discussion. Thank you, Kathy, Gretchen, Ratan. It's always so fascinating to speak with each of you, both individually and in a setting like this. And as usual, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you all for your time and your participation today. And I know we had a lot of questions. We got to some of them. Some of them we maybe did answer directly. We've captured all of them. If you signed up and we see your name here, we will get a response to your questions via email. And if you don't have an email with us, you can always send us an email with your question at info@rtca.org, and we'll get an answer for you. So again, I want to take just a moment and thank our sponsors for today's webinar, the Airline Pilots Associations, Collins Aerospace, and the National Air Traffic Controller Association for our gold corporate sponsorship this year, and to Garmin for sponsoring today's webinar. For the audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope you found today's presentations educational, inspiring, and evolving. And again, these webinars are being recorded, so if you want to review anything presented today or any of our past webinars, you can do so by going to the RTCA YouTube channel. It's been a fantastic discussion, especially on this important topic. So I would be remiss if I did not give one more plug to our Human Factors training course. It's scheduled for October 25th through the 27th. This is being presented in conjunction with Georgia Tech University. 3-day course is going to provide you a practical application of human factors engineering for personnel that are involved in the management, engineering, and operations of aircraft. Again, I will not, as Kathy said, you don't have to be a human factors expert, but this course will do a great job of giving you some of the important aspects of human factors, where it needs to be applied, when it needs to be applied, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. So again, you can sign up for this course or any of our other courses at www.rtca.org. I hope you'll be able to all join us for our next webinar, which is right now scheduled for Wednesday, October 17th. Again, at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll have another fabulous discussion about a timely topic of interest to the aviation community. So thank you all again for being here and for making RTCA a part of your day.